Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In this video, I want to kind of do a recap on understanding the importance of the concept of torque when it comes to resistance training. Now, as a personal trainer, a large part of what we try to do is to help people in resistance training not to get hurt, learn how to essentially use enough resistance or load on the exercises to provide enough stimulus to get the necessary changes that you're trying to establish for these particular clients. And there are, any number of methodologies, and most of them work, right? Different ways to create periodization schedules for folks, or just do straight type of sets with resistance, doing drop sets, supersets, things like that. There's any number of ways to help people to move forward in their strength, in their just overall wellness. And we, as personal trainers versus like athletic trainers, we're trying to help people generally in the wellness kind of side of the house, as well as fitness, of course. And if you got athletes, that's great. But in this video, I want to just kind of give you a basic explanation or overview of this concept of torque, because it can be a little confusing, because the concept of torque comes from the field of physics. So in physics, you remember high school physics? You all remember that? And I'm sure some of you might have had to take it in college. But in high school physics, you learn about the sort of subdivisions of the field of physics, right? So you have electricity and electromagnetism, and you have all these things. So in resistance training, we're focused on biomechanics. So mechanics is part of the sort of one of the subfields in physics. We deal with biomechanics, right? The human movement system, right? And the idea is that if you can understand, some basic concepts related to human movement and biomechanics, you can definitely help people. But even more important, in my opinion, is you could ensure that people don't get hurt. That's a big part of what we do as trainers when we're dealing with detrained individuals. So this idea of torque is really, really important. So essentially, and I don't want to get into scratch too far below the surface, but torque is the concept of what's known as angular force. So if you think about an object, right? And this sort of the classic way to understand this is like a car moving forward down the road, right? This would be what's known as linear movement, right? Straight movement, easy to understand. So a car moving down the road, something moving up in the air, something moving down. Well, that's called linear motion. Torque takes linear motion, and linear motion has some um, basic formulas that are used. And the one that we see in the linear realm is this, and you've probably seen this, right? F equals ma. Force is equal to mass times acceleration, right? I'm bringing back some bad memories for some of you, but it's really helpful to understand, right? The force associated with a moving object is going to be equivalent to the mass of the object, right? Generally kilograms, multiplied by its acceleration, right? So it's the velocity increase over time. And so you have all these equations you could throw. Don't worry about any of that. That's why I'm trying to explain this in a way that makes it simple. Torque, right, versus force, simply throws a wrench in the machine, because now you're not talking about linear movement. We're talking about angular movement. And we create angular motion by having a long, like a bone, for instance, that is attached on one end to something that's, quote, immovable, i.e., a joint, right? So imagine this is your upper arm bone, right? Your upper arm bone. It's attached to the shoulder joint right there, right? And then you got your elbow. And then if you've got your elbow joint, you got the two bones, the ulnar and the radius, for instance, of the forearm. So if my elbow remains positioned intact without moving, now I can create what's called angular motion. See the difference? I can take the pen and move it up and down like this, linear motion, right? Force is equal to mass times acceleration. Well, in the concept of torque, now we're dealing with not straight linear movement, but one side or the other, right, is going to be fixed. And now you can have movement around this central fixed point. And now we are in a whole nother realm of rotational motion, and we have to use different terms. And instead of using the term force, we use the term torque. Um, and please don't go Google this because you'll go down a rabbit hole you might not get out of. So in personal training, when we're talking about resistance training, the idea of torque is that basically you have no options because the body biomechanically is made up of joints and body segments or bones or groupings of bones or something like that. We generally use the term body segments. So in the case of, we'll use the arm, the shoulder is a joint. It's fixed, it's stationary, right? If I just stand here, and my arm, right, which contains multiple joints, can be seen as a single segment. Like if I lift my arm up and out to the side, right? Lift my arm up and out to the side, it's a single segment. You and I know that there's multiple segments, right? The elbow and the wrist and the finger joints, right? So torque simply says that when we're dealing with, and make this easy from the perspective of an exercise like lateral raises, torque simply says that instead of using the term mass or the terms mass and acceleration, we can now use angular equivalent terms, right? And the one term that is critically important is what's known as the moment arm. This is what I'm generally asked. What does the moment arm mean? And the easiest way to explain the moment arm without going in depth into terminology and into the geometry, for instance, or the trigonometry in this case, really all you have to understand is that as a resistance, like a dumbbell, and I'm holding a dumbbell, as the resistance moves further away from the particular joint in question that we are working, while maintaining a perpendicular distance from that joint, as long as that increases, you're going to feel like the resistance you're using is heavier and then subsequently lighter. Again, the best exercise to demonstrate this with is generally the lateral raise. So if I take a dumbbell and lift it up and out to the side, let's say I'm holding a 5 pound dumbbell. Now imagine this. You do lateral raises. I hope you're all doing lateral raises if you can. But imagine holding a 5 pound dumbbell and I'm going to train my deltoids. When I hold it down to the side, my side, it doesn't feel like there's much resistance on the deltoid. Why? Because the torque, which is a calculation, is essentially zero. There's no feeling of angular force. That's why when I hold it here, I don't feel it in my deltoid. But what happens when I lift it up and out to the side? Initially, when I lift it to right here, you can see that in the video, it's not that heavy. I mean, 5 pounds, not. But what happens when I lift it further and further and the perpendicular distance from my shoulder where that load is goes further and further away from my body? It feels heavier. Now, you know this intrinsically when you're doing a lateral raise. You notice this when you do pretty much any exercise. Well, the reason that you feel changes in how heavy a resistance, the same resistance feels throughout certain movement patterns, one of the reasons because of this concept of torque or the feeling of resistance on the particular muscle. Of course, the other reason is that there's just biomechanical reasons, like you got two joints moving and there's compound movement in the bench press, for instance. But the point is that when we're doing single joint movements like this, again, the idea is that if you're doing lateral raises, doing a dumbbell curl, a leg extension, non-compound movements is the easiest way to understand it. What happens is that because of the angular nature of motion, because of a joint, fixed point, you change the feeling of load, even though the load that you're using, the 5 pound dumbbell, didn't change. But if I've had you grab 10 pound dumbbells, you would feel heavier and heavier and heavier. Why? Because the load, which hasn't changed, it's still 10 pounds, is now from a perpendicular 90-degree distance. Perpendicular distance has increased further away from the joint, right? From a perpendicular perspective, that 10 pound dumbbell, you can't see it on the video, but it's down here hanging at my side, right? That 10 pounds from a perpendicular perspective is further and further away from, it's called the fulcrum, but from the shoulder joint. And the further away it goes from a perpendicular perspective, it feels heavier. So you don't have to go crazy and explain all this to a client. You just explain the simplicity of the mechanics, which is as that dumbbell goes further and further away from you, it's going to go further from the shoulder, but not just because of the length of the arm. That doesn't matter. It's still the same length. The arm hasn't changed length. It's the perpendicular distance away from that particular joint. So that as I go further and further perpendicular away, that's where it's going to feel heaviest. The weight hasn't changed, right? But the mechanics of torque, or the concept of torque, and what we call the moment arm has, because the moment arm, which is the perpendicular distance between the load or the resistance and that pivot point, or that fulcrum that we're doing here, this pivot point, which is the shoulder, as that distance increases, the torque, right, increases, just like force increases when you accelerate a moving object, force goes up. Okay. And so all we're doing is we're changing this equation of F equals ma into torque. And okay, so torque is angular force. You essentially have angular mass and angular acceleration. But again, without getting too deep into that, if you want to go on to some site where you can explain the physics, you don't need to do that. When we're talking to clients, we explain it in that way. As the dumbbell moves further and further away from the shoulder, perpendicular wise, perpendicular distance, 90 degrees, it's going to feel heavier. Now, the actual reason we even talk about this is because that is how your range of motion is defined. Okay. I switch this up, and this is where I can explain to somebody this is why on a dumbbell lateral raise, we don't go all the way down. Why? Because when torque it gets closer and closer to zero, you have no tension on the muscle. Why are you doing the exercise in this range of motion when there's little to no tension on the muscle? So your concept of torque, this understanding in the realm of biomechanics, helps you to determine, to a greater or lesser extent, how far you're going to move on your range of motion. If the goal of the resistance training exercise and the load you're using is to put stress and tension maximally on a particular muscle, on the muscle's range of motion, then we don't want to be going into areas in that range of motion where torque is sort of going down lower and lower and lower to ultimately there's no tension, or when torque is zero. What does that look like? So in other words, when I do a lateral raise, I don't have to go much higher than parallel. More, the higher I go from this perspective, there's a lot of tension on my deltoids when I do lateral raises. But the higher I go, now that tension is going to shift into my trapezius as I get scapular rotation. So you can go here, you go here, whatever. It's not that big of a deal. But as soon as I come down, what's happening to the perpendicular distance, right, of the 10-pound dumbbell and the position of my shoulder? It starts to decrease to the point where the torque actually starts to trend toward zero. And you're going to get to a point where that 10-pound dumbbell doesn't feel like anything. So why are you going all the way down to the bottom for? Don't get me wrong. There are other reasons in a different context you might want to do that as the weights get really, really heavy. But for the average client doing it, you don't have to go down any further than about here. Can you see that on the video? Yeah, can you see that? You don't have to go down, number one, to your side. Why? Because there's no resistance. There's no essential angular force being generated by that 10-pound dumbbell. Just do it yourself. That's why you go down all the way when you're doing yours. You're like, oh, and you're resting and there's no resistance on your deltoid. Well, you're not maximizing the fatigue component of the exercise when you do that. There's a fatigue and a strength and a power element to this. I'm not going to get into on this video. But the point is that now you can determine the range of motion, because yes, if you're feeling it or you're not feeling it, you might want to consider, well, wait a minute, is there any tension on my deltoid? As a for instance, is there any tension on my bicep up here other than me squeezing it? Is there any tension down it? Yes. A lot. Is there more tension when I move my arm forward? Well, this is where the concept of torque can be helpful. So I hope it didn't cause more confusion, but I'm asked this question quite a bit for an explanation of it. And I can go into a little bit deeper, but again, for personal trainers, it's not the most critical concept other than sort of that superficial understanding of how the muscle feels or develops tension based on the position, which is going to determine the amount of torque or sort of that feeling of how heavy or light a particular weight feels on a particular exercise. So again, I hope that was helpful. Just let us know if this did make sense. Write the word understand in the comment section below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so. And again, if it confused you more, you can write that down as well. And I could be a little bit more, um, give a little bit more explanation to it if you would like. Have a great week. We'll see you next week. Take care. Bye.